All right, welcome everybody.
Okay, welcome everybody to History Matters and carefully hiding the coffee cup. So does coffee. Matt is drinking on cue. Today we're doing something we've done, I think maybe once before in September, and that is an anything goes session, meaning that we're really going to open things up for discussion, comments, whatever. Matt, in a moment, will offer the rules of the game. I will just say, I think, normally there's so much happening these days that when I'm trying to decide what to talk about, it's not hard to figure out something. This week, I think partly because it's the end of the semester, I thought it might be a good, not necessarily venting time, but voicing time. So that's what we're having today, is a voicing and pondering moment on History Matters. But before we begin, I will turn things over to my partner in crime, Matt, who will explain the rules of the game.
And welcome everybody. Hope everybody had a great week. It's good to see everybody. And those of you who weren't here last week, I kind of popped off in the middle of the show, and I promise I'll be here the whole time this time. But rules of the game are as follows. We encourage you to use chat to discuss topics germane to the conversation, and always keep them family friendly. But we'd like to hear from you and how things are going on your end. If you do have questions, we will, you can use the Q&A. Because of the format today, you can use chat for questions too. We'll try to keep up on those. But if you don't hear us reply to them, go ahead and put them in Q&A, and we'll try to tackle those in there. Otherwise, as always, if you like what we do here at the National Council of History Education, please make sure to join us at www.ncheteach.org and look around. Try join one of our webinars, or look at our virtual learning center, or all kinds of good fun stuff on there. We do have a conference coming up in April that just make sure everybody's aware of that. So we will be we're doing early bird registrations for that right now. It's a virtual conference. Looking forward to that. And additionally, as I mentioned in the past, 1 week from today, we will be welcoming Pete Souza, former chief photographer for the White House under Presidents Reagan and Obama, for a conversation about, it's called Eyewitness to History. So it should be a fantastic evening. It's going to be moderated by the good folks at by Leanne Potter, who's the education director for the Library of Congress, and it's going to be a really nice evening. So please join us for that. If you haven't registered, please do quickly. See, we're nearing 1,000 people in there already. So
wow.
so we're really excited to see that continue to grow. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Joanne. And Joanne, I'll hang out today, so it's a little more conversational, because that's sort of how we roll here. And at some point, I'll talk about my background. I know there've been a couple questions about that. I'm not ignoring you, I promise. I'm just ignoring you. So, turning it over to Joanne to get us started for the day.
And I will. Dave weighed in immediately. So I'm going to weigh in immediately too with that question. Dave asked, what happened to federalism in the last 3 to 4 days? And actually, I want to talk about federalism. That's an excellent question for just a few moments, because we're kind of living with the legacy of federalism as envisioned in the founding period, sort of. The whole idea of federalism was really an innovation. If you think about, or actually read the Constitution, as everyone should, one of the things you see is that they really don't talk about national anythings in the Constitution. Federalism, we're in New York, there are now horns beeping outside. Federalism was a way to get past the threat and the sort of overpowering sense of power of a national something. So federalism was a brilliant compromise point of view, which said, it's a federal government. So the national government has some power, the state governments have some power, it's flexible, so the states aren't surrendering all of their power to the national government. And that eased enough people in their fears about assigning power to the national government that went through, makes sense. And throughout our history, we've seen different versions of federalism coming and going. This particular presidency, I think, has, certainly to me as a historian, shown versions of federalism that I don't know if I've quite seen before in my lifetime. So, you know, some of that was seen during the pandemic response when no one was quite sure who was supposed to be responding to what. And I think I went on Twitter at some early point and said, I will never teach the Articles of Confederation the same way ever again, because that's a case in which you say, you know, wow, you know, the states really didn't have enough power. We needed a national government. And somehow we were in this moment where the states maybe needed power because I wasn't sure what the national government was doing. So anyway, we're in another one of those weird moments where states are asserting claims over other states. It's unclear. I mean, as a historian, and there is still a part of my brain, historian brain, that looks at these sorts of things and thinks they're fascinating, right? That is able to detach enough to say, no, now is an interesting moment. Now we're sort of working through what power states have over other states. What role are the courts going to play in this? Can we all agree that elections aren't generally decided by the judiciary, but actually are decided by us? There are all of these interesting things happening now, which are not very fun to live through, but are interesting because of all of the ways in which they challenge, I think, everyone's assumptions. And I think that's true of historians and probably political scientists as well. I won't speak for them. But that's my 2-minute riff, or maybe my 4-minute riff on federalism. It's absolutely at the center of what we're seeing right now. And there aren't many absolute answers, because even if there are what should be absolute answers, there are all kinds of weird challenges to them going on right now. So to say it is an interesting moment is to offer a vast understatement.
Out of curiosity, how will you teach the Articles of Confederation? That's a tough one for K-12 teachers to teach, too. And you know, I imagine it gets a little easier as you teach it at the collegiate level. But what's your approach going to be now that we're living through what we're living through?
That's a good question. I mean, normally my take on the articles, and if you see my online revolution course, you'll see it, has been that I think, oh, newbie's rousing himself up here.
It's a great question. He's excited.
He is. He wants to talk about the Articles of Confederation, clearly. And thank you, newbie, for your thoughts. I normally teach it by saying it kind of gets a bum rap, because people say, oh, what a ridiculous government. Of course, we needed a constitution, which of course isn't the case. It was a government that made perfect sense at the time that it happened. And then people went on to realize something else was required. I suppose when I'm teaching it now, I might be firmer about the idea of rights and wrongs and things that do work and things that don't work, because all of that's being challenged right now. And while I do think there needed to be a stronger national government at that point in time, I think this is not going to surprise anyone who has been here over the weeks. There's going to be more contingency, even more contingency, about what works and what doesn't and what's right and wrong. And the articles, rather than a weird sort of ragtag collection of states that was not useful, not powerful, and needed to be dismissed, will be one try, and not necessarily even a bad try, just a try. And that having federalism and a national something made sense, but the degree to which federalism is flexible and amorphous, I'll probably emphasize that more too when I teach in the future, because we're living through that.
All right. All right, so I got a couple questions in the Q&A.
Okay. I'm also scrolling. I know I hate when people are doing things and staring.
I know. I apologize.
I know. I'm doing it too, so I apologize too in advance.
Greg wants to know, in your research for your book on violence in Congress, did you come across how Charles Sumner's time in France molded his opinions when he later became a congressman?
Oh, interesting. I don't think I did, because I don't think, for the purposes of my book, that's a great question. I was less interested in his policies and more interested in his party affiliation, his stance on slavery, and how that obviously played out on the floor. So I didn't. When I researched Sumner, I read some of his letters and writings leading up to actually 1854 through 1856. And then I read in his papers some of the correspondence he received after the caning, which was actually really powerful, right? There was a collection of letters from people from all over the place and people of all kinds. There were letters from children talking about how they heard about the caning in school, and it made them want to cry, and it made them want to come to Washington and hit the person who hit him. I mean, while I didn't look to see what happened in France, what I did see in a way that I don't think I'd recognized before was the emotional impact of that. Although intellectually I knew that, it was so evident in the response. And then I read his letters after the caning too, and it took a real psychological toll on him, and that was interesting to see as well. So that was really more my interest, but it's a fine question that if I were doing more work on Sumner, I would want to know. But at the moment, I'm not Sumnerizing, as someone put it at the time. I'm wandering off in different directions.
You mentioned something in there that I think people would be really interested to hear more about, which is, you said I was less focused on this and more focused on that. Could you talk a little bit about how a historian makes choices about what to focus on in the research process and in the writing process? Because I think that a lot of time gets overlooked when we talk about historiography. So I think it's worth talking about just a little bit.
Thank you, Matt. That's a really good question. I think there are a couple of different answers. So I think at the beginning of a project, certainly when you enter a project, you go in with certain questions and certain biases, right? And ideally, you're aware of both. Mm-hmm. To me, when I'm working on a project, I may go in like this last book that I wrote on violence. I actually didn't go into that project writing a book about violence. So this is maybe part of the answer. I wanted to write about honor and politics after the period I'd written about in my first book, and stumbled across the violence in the first few days of my research. And here's one example, one answer to Matt's question, which is I saw surprising evidence that I didn't understand. I asked questions like, is this representative? Is there more of it? Is there less of it? And tried to get a sense of what I was seeing. And when I really got a sense of the amount of violence that I was seeing, well, then that became my real quest, was to figure out what I was seeing and collect evidence of it. Then, of course, the next question is, what questions do you ask with it and what do you do? And that was hard. It took me a long time to figure out what I was saying with the evidence I found. What I found was, hundreds of incidents and 70 that I was willing to count as violent. And I could say all kinds of things about it, but the questions that I could answer with it, in a way, didn't become apparent until I started writing about it. So, I think the shorter version of what I just said is sometimes the evidence tells you the questions that need to be asked, and you have to be open to the evidence. So no matter what you do when you enter a project, if you go in with an absolute decided question, you can always find evidence to support that decided question. If you go in with a sense of what you want and are open-minded, you're much more open to being surprised. And of course, that's part of the key to doing good history is your willingness to be led in the direction that the evidence leads you. But once you get into the project, ideally the project tells you where it wants to go, and then sometimes it doesn't, and you yell at your evidence, as I did many times in writing the last book. Come on, what are you showing me? It's all about the questions, and I'll offer you an example of a failure of mine on this front. When I did my first book, Affairs of Honor, man, there's all kinds of stuff going on behind me. When I was working on Affairs of Honor, the first chapter I did was the chapter on political gossip, and Thomas Jefferson is at the center of that chapter. That was my master's thesis. And so I wrote that, I did it, I looked around in his writings, I talked about what I wrote, and I continued from there. What I didn't see and what I didn't write about in Jefferson's papers was the involvement at all of women. Why? Because Jefferson really wanted nothing to do with women in politics. So I happily churned my way through that book, and partway through realized, wait a minute, part of the reason I'm not seeing women is because I'm not looking, because Thomas Jefferson suggested to me that they weren't there. So if I were writing that book over again, I don't think it would drastically change what I said, but I think there might be more involvement by women in the book, whether it's as people having an influence in some way or another, or having something to say. But there's a case in which I didn't ask a question I could have asked, and I blame Thomas Jefferson entirely. But that's an example of my wishing I had thought more about the very sort of thing that Matt is asking.
So earlier, Tom asked about the case before the Supreme Court. They're supposed to make some kind of decision about whether or not to hear the case from the Attorney General in Texas, who is suing 5 states for reasons that, well, I won't comment on that. But the question was about whether or not that there's been anything like that in the past. And my reading of sort of I don't know, what I'm hearing is that this would be a very uncommon aspect of one state suing another state for original jurisdiction. But could you talk a little bit about I know you're not, how do I want to phrase this? Can we talk a little about this idea of original jurisdiction, sort of where it came from, and in the political climate of the founding period, where somebody at some point made a decision that states should be allowed to sue each other and to the Supreme Court in order to have these conversations. Can you talk about that? I know I'm throwing this at you with no preparation whatsoever. So
I don't have a lot to say about that. I mean, what I can say is the degree to which states considered themselves nation states in the early years, in the 1780s and even into the 1790s. We don't think about that, and we underestimate the impact of that, which is goes back to where I started, right? Part of the reason why anything having power over the states is because the states very much felt like independent entities, and as colonies, although they were colonies, they kind of had been. So it makes sense when you're thinking about any policy having to do with the states in this time period. I think you have to factor in what they understood states to be. I mean, it's for good reason that Thomas Jefferson called Virginia my country well into the 1790s. And of course, he would say he was American, but he also meant what he said that way about Virginia. So that framed everything in this time period. I don't have an absolute answer to the specific question that Matt asked, but part of my answer would be just what I just said.
No, I think that's really helpful. So Melissa did some tweeting last night, and so I'm going to kind of take that. And she put the question in here, which is about the founders. But she wanted to play a little time travel, which I know we try to avoid as much as possible. But
anything goes.
But this is anything goes, and so she is using the time for a really good question here, which is which founders and families were more or less flexible? And I think what she's referring to is sort of their flexible, the malleability of their ideologies, like, and how they evolved and changed. Whose opinions evolved the most? Who would adjust best to our society? Are the questions.
Okay, so let's start in general with flexible opinions, and then I'll go specific. One of the first thing, this will not surprise you at all, the first thing that leapt into my mind when you asked that question about ideology versus flexible opinions is a letter by Hamilton in the lead up to the election of 1800, when he's, to not put it nicely, freaked out at the idea that Aaron Burr might become president. And he writes a letter to a Federalist. He's writing frantically to Federalists, trying to get them to not support Burr. And one of the things he says is, and this is going to be a bad paraphrase, something like, it has been suggested that Aaron Burr is very useful to have on your side because he has no fixed principles. And Hamilton writes in this letter, he he has no fixed principles. It's like, what are you talking about? Like, you can see the steam coming off the letter. Like, this is not good. But what people were saying at the time, and there are letters that I've seen from people saying, you know, what a handy guy to have on your side. He was flexible in ways both, I don't want to say good and bad, but opportunistic and maybe not so opportunistic. He was. He is, you know, one of the sort of most, I don't want to use all these modern words. I want to say feminist, but he was open to thinking about the rights of women in a way that many others weren't. He read Mary Wollstonecraft, and there's a letter of his in which he notes that he can't find any man to talk about that with him about it because no one wants to admit they read it. So in some ways, he's really progressive in his politics, but he also, you know, was flexible in his ideology. He kind of bounced back and forth to different sides. Newby has strong feelings about Aaron Burr. So, you know, there's a great example. Burr's a great example of, for better and worse, according to who you asked, he was flexible. There's an article probably from the 1970s that sometimes I draw. It has a graph in it that sometimes I draw on the board when I'm teaching politics and parties in the 1790s. And it has this like an XY axis kind of graph or chart. And it has X's representing where the Republicans vote and where the Federalists vote. You can see like there's a cluster of Republicans about different issues on one side and a cluster of Federalists. And there's this one X in the middle, and that's Aaron Burr. So, you know, a lot of them were not flexible when they could have been and should have been, right? Because things were being decided at this moment. And a lot of people, and Hamilton is in this camp and Jefferson is in this camp, felt that their cluster of views were the best for the nation, and people who disagreed with them were out for no good and would hurt the nation. That's a kind of extreme, rigid view that leads to extreme polarization. So that it wasn't necessarily the most useful thing. On the other hand, I teach the founding this way too. Having a lot of different strident voices and opinions bang up against each other in this time period was important. It was important because it showed that that could happen. And it was important because there was no one view that consistently won out. It was a cacophony of different voices and ideas that came together and shaped the path that we took. And, you know, that's kind of the way the system is supposed to work.
I think that's super helpful. And it really speaks to this. We had talked about this, I think, a few weeks ago, this idea of originalism and how one of the problems is this idea of, well, there is no monolithic founder's voice. And I think that really speaks to that, right? Like this idea that they, in some sense, had some, as I said, malleability in terms of their voice, but the idea of having principles, I think, is such an important aspect of that, right? Like that there were, I'm not sure if ideology is right. Maybe you can correct me. Is ideology the right word? They had a driving ideology, or was it they had a driving sense of what mattered? And those are in some ways kind of two different things, right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's always hard to generalize about, you know, the founders or the framers, right, because there isn't one big blob of them. What I was about to say, and then what I sort of reeled back in before I even said it, I was about to say they were thinking about the impact of their actions on posterity, mm-hmm, which in many cases was true. However, that doesn't mean they also weren't thinking about their own private interest as well. So even as I was about to say, well, they all agreed on the importance of posterity, yeah, and they also were all thinking about the total opposite of that at the same time. So, and they weren't all thinking about posterity. So yeah, I mean, as you're suggesting, Matt, and that we talked about, I don't know, a week or two ago, there's no one big block of framer view. Even as I'm showing right here, as I'm working it out in my head, you can't even say they were all posterity minded, because they weren't. So given that, you know, to look at their ideas, whether it's ideology or policy or understandings, they certainly had certain shared understandings because they were all alive in the late 18th century, and that matters. But when you go individual to individual, I mean, this keeps historians busy, right? When you go to different individuals, you get totally different outlooks. So there are a bunch of reasons why originalism is problematic. This is one, is that, if we sat here and as historians worked our way through even just the people in the room at the federal convention, the Constitutional Convention, we would not come away with one understanding of what was going on.
Right.
So, there are other reasons too about, being ahistorical and anything else, but from a historical point of view, it doesn't really fully make sense to me.
Right. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like what you're saying is that difference of opinion was healthy. That was a healthy component of how the nation developed at the time. Is that a fair statement? Or
from our point of view, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think you
don't think they would say that?
No. If you were a Federalist in the 1790s, you were not thrilled that the Republicans were doing what they were doing. But from my point of view, from our point of view, yeah, the fact that there were differences of opinion really mattered and was good. They honestly felt, each side honestly felt for the most part that the other side was doing something dangerous and self-interested, because although they agreed that people would have different opinions, they also assumed that opinions would clash and come together, and then out of that would come some agreement. Debate and compromise was a boxed set in a way. So they didn't think that political parties were going to be an organized, consistent thing. And they didn't assume that there would be an organized opposition party. And so when they saw that kind of thing happening, that didn't feel to them like clashing opinions. That felt to them like a group of people out for themselves, which I always laugh when I say that, because you could argue that all political parties fit that definition. But yeah, it's complicated. It's complicated. It's the ultimate
complicated
statement. It is complicated. But yeah, it at the time they were sort of processing their way through a lot of the things that we're asking now.
That's good. Well, let's switch tacks a little bit. So we were talking about I've been dominating the conversation here, and my apologies to the audience for that. And really mostly to Joanne for that. I think it was Richard asked an interesting question. I'm not sure how much you can comment on this, but did Washington freeing his slaves reflect more his flexibility or his concern with posterity? And just as a reminder, Washington didn't exactly, he freed one slave, but then he said all the other slaves would be freed when Martha dies, right?
Right. So he would not be.
Did sort of that element of sort of, did that reflect his concern with posterity and with the notion of slavery, or his flexibility and sort of his evolution of thinking about slavery? And
that's a good question.
I know that's probably more of a Annette Gordon Reed kind of question, but
it is
what your thoughts are.
So on the one hand, I think past a certain point, almost anything that Washington did, he knew that it would it would shape his reputation in the present and in the future in some way. And so anything that he did, and in particular something like this, that he would have assumed it would affect his reputation. As far as his shift in thinking about slavery over time, I don't know if there was a dramatic shift in his view about slavery over time. There's evidence that when he was in Philadelphia, he was doing what he could as the national capital. He was doing what he could. It was bringing his enslaved people outside of Philadelphia and back in, so that they would not, by law, be freed, so that he would retain ownership of them. So, he dies in 1799. We're talking about behavior that he did, a couple of years before that. So I think it's valid to think that someone thought about freeing their slaves, didn't do it during their own lifetime or in any way that would inconvenience anyone they knew, or if it would affect the value of their property, if they were in debt and they felt that this would, like Jefferson, hurt them in some way and didn't do it. I think it's messy. Surprise. And So I wouldn't say that's an example of flexibility. I would say that's an example of the enmeshed, conflicting things that people thought about slavery and how they responded to it and didn't, even when they were doing something positive. It wasn't necessarily a wonderful, freeing, positive thing. It was more complicated than that.
And so this was, and I'm asking this question because something similar was brought up during the NCSS conference National Council for Social Studies conference last week. Did Hamilton, how did Hamilton evolve over time on the issue of slavery?
Did he evolve? So here's the thing, and this obviously has been in the news a lot. There's not a lot in his papers as far as his own expression about slavery. There's just not a lot. There's the statement in which he supports his friend John Lawrence's attempt to create a Black battalion during the Revolution. He supports that, writes in favor of it on Lawrence's behalf. There's his membership in the New York Manumission Society and his involvement in manumission in New York State. There's also the fact that his father-in-law enslaved people, and certainly that he was involved in financial affairs involving enslaved people. There's the paper that came out that suggests that the Hamilton family itself owned people, and I can't remember what the phrasing is that I used in the New York Times, but basically I would be totally willing to believe that. And I think that the paper has interesting evidence on that. I'm not coming straight out and saying yes, only because as with anything, I want to see the stuff myself. Not that I don't trust the person who did it, but this is why I actually never have research assistants helping me on my work. Not that I don't trust my wonderful students or colleagues, but I want to see all the evidence for myself. So the short answer is he could have enslaved people. I don't know if there's much evolution. I think people say, for example, that, he saw slavery in the Indies and it horrified him. I don't know where there's evidence of that. And I don't think the fact that he supported Lawrence's idea necessarily is linked to whatever he saw in the Indies. So I think, well, I've said this before, there's a spectrum of views on slavery, and there are some who are pro-slavery and some who are aggressively anti-slavery, and then there's a middle ground, a messy middle ground that sometimes involves, ideology, but opportunism, self-interest, and uneasiness. I mean, I guess in the same way that you can't say there's a block founder view about the government, the only block thing you could say generally about slavery is that people allowed it to happen. They either fostered it, enabled it, or allowed it for a long time. Beyond that, I think you have to, it becomes complicated, but that basic factor that it was there, it was allowed to be there, it was factored into the creation of the government and assumed to be a part of American nationhood, those are facts.
Wow, thank you so much. I just want to say, Greg, you're killing it on the questions. I got another great one from Greg that I got to ask because you might have some insight about this. And I may completely butcher this word because I don't say it out loud very often. Did the tradition of primogeniture in Britain have an influence on how the founders conceived the principles in the founding documents? Were they thinking about this sort of right of firstborn as they were crafting the policies the documents that created our nation?
Well, certainly they were aware of it. And I think in some, I don't have specifics, but I think, for example, in Virginia, when they're working on state constitutions, that was one of the things that they thought about, because it wasn't obviously just in Britain. It had been in existence in the colonies too, as part of the British Empire. So yeah, I do think that was part of what they were considering. I can't sit here, unfortunately, and name for you like, in 1782, yeah, I wish I could. I can do that with some things, but not with this particular issue. But yeah, they were aware of that, and they were aware of a related issue, which has to do with women and ownership of property, and some women were pushing their way into that conversation and wrestling with that in this time period as well. My one of my former students, Michael Blakeman, wrote an article about a woman who was arguing to have ownership of land, a really interesting piece that she left behind a lot of evidence that enables you to actually, in this case, see what she's thinking. But yeah, land was all, right? Land was property, money, influence, stability. So it makes sense that arguments over who owned estates, how they were divided, had to do with fundamental things like citizenship, and power and status.
It's really helpful.
I want to.
So it's 10:40.
Okay.
And I imagine folks, I know some folks are going to have to trickle away and go teach in a few minutes. So I thought maybe it'd be a good time. Can we do mug and background, and then we'll return to some questions? Does that work?
Yeah, I do want to point out one thing, only that Emily has posted a link to a Mount Vernon exhibit on slavery, which I wanted to point out because that would be a great thing for people to know about.
Yes, and if you are a member of NCHE, we did a tour of like a virtual field trip in that area by Mount Vernon during our Equity Summit. And so you can go to the Equity Summit, you should be able to find that. So if you want to, like a virtual tour, we did that as part of our Equity Summit. So, okay, let's do background and mugs. So,
okay.
You want to rock, paper, scissors for who goes first?
Well, I'll go first.
Okay.
I normally do. I'll stick with tradition.
Okay, sounds good.
And in this case, because in a sense, an Anything Goes Day is a History Matters community day, Carolee. I have Carolee made this mug, the Yay History mug, that has the original Yay History tweet on it. So Carolee, thank you for this. This is a tribute to the History Matters community, which is why we can do an Anything Goes episode, because you guys are there, you're part of this community, we engage with each other, we really want to wrestle with ideas, and I always thank you guys for that, but this is a great episode to do that in a big way, and the mug kind of helps to do that.
Oh, that's amazing.
And thank you again, Carolee.
And I literally almost used the Pomp and Crest one that Carolee sent me today. I went with Raise Good Humans, I think, today, but
that was your mug.
Oh yeah, so this is some of you may have caught this, so this is my Raise Good Humans mug.
Excellent.
So the background, there were some questions early on. I had to go deep for this one because I couldn't use the Anything Goes marquee again. This is the childhood home of Cole Porter behind me.
Wow. Wow. Okay, I never would have guessed that, except that I hope people saw on one of the tweets I sent out about today's show, I had a is it GIF or GIF? I always say GIF.
There is some argument about that. So I always say GIF, but
I say GIF, whatever it is. I had people dancing to Anything Goes by Cole Porter as my tweet. So we were in the same space, Matt, but I never in 1,000 years would have guessed that. No.
Yeah, well, so I was originally going to go with the Coliseum, which is sort of the quintessential Anything Goes place, but yeah, the last second I switched to this one. This is, and by the way, I found there's a fascinating article about this house. Apparently, it was, so this is an AP story from 2019. It had fallen into disrepair and became a meth house. Cole Porter's house was a meth house, apparently. And a acting nonprofit in Peru, and this is in Peru, Indiana, where Cole Porter was born, bought this house and renovated it, and then ran out of money, and they sold it to a couple in Peru, who now run it as a bed and breakfast with 3 rooms, and each room is a different theme on Cole Porter, apparently. So I did not have enough time to look any further into that, but the fact that it was a meth house at one point just really stuck out to me as like this.
Yeah, that talk about not guessing in 1,000 years. That's kind of
right.
I also want to point out, Ben says Cole Porter, Yale class of 1913, he thinks, and creator of Bulldog, Bow Wow Wow. Really? She said, slightly amused and slightly despairingly. Wow, I didn't know that Cole Porter went to Yale, and Bulldog, Bow Wow Wow.
You didn't know that he went to Yale? He was one of the original Whiffenpoofs.
I did not know that.
I believe, right?
And my former student / Whiffenpoof people will probably be disappointed in me for saying that.
I know. I thought the Anything Goes were just a way for you to show your Yale love by forcing me to look up the Whiffenpoof history.
No.
I'm a huge Cole Porter fan, so that's the reason.
Thank you for giving me that credit.
Larry found the article.
Okay. You guys are quick.
They are.
Larry did fine.
Okay, we still have a little bit of time, so let's return to some questions.
Bula.
Connie asked a question in the Q&A, which is, could we touch on DC statehood from a historical perspective? Do you know anything about DC statehood from a historical perspective, lack of representation, etc.? How did we get DC as DC and all that kind of good stuff?
Well, the short version of that is, the idea was, so obviously it was a contentious thing as to where the national capital would be, bound up with the assumption of state debts. We all saw that in the Hamilton musical, or at least listened to it in Hamilton musical. And part of the question was, wherever the capital went, it would be a place that would have influence. And so it was a big deal. So it starts out in New York, it moves to Philadelphia, and then it's going to move to a location to the south, which ends up being what we now see as DC. But the idea was they were creating a capital from scratch to represent the spirit of the new government. So there's a reason why the Capitol and the White House sort of face each other at the opposite ends of I think it's Pennsylvania Avenue, maybe. I'm bad with streets in DC. At any rate, everything in Washington that they were doing, and they were thinking about it in the 1790s, they're trying to bring to life the spirit of government. And although clearly there were people there before, because it's part of Maryland and part of Virginia becomes the District of Columbia, the idea was that it wasn't part of any state. They weren't creating a new state by creating DC. They were creating a capital city in and of itself. So statehood, that's become an issue because, in a sense, they have no, among other things, no representatives in Congress. Congress basically looks over the District of Columbia. But I think initially the idea was that it would be a new capital city, and it would embody the spirit of small r Republican governance.
Beth would like to hear you talk a little bit about the history of executive privilege, if you can.
Well, that's also a thing that's being debated in this period. You can see that during Washington's presidency, when sometimes Congress would make a demand for papers, and there would be a debate, and very often Hamilton would be at the front of the room saying, no, the president doesn't have to do this. The question of the power of the executive and the power of Congress, obviously, even though they're constitutionally defined, has always been something that is contentious. And even the executive department, more broadly, versus Congress. There's a great, it's another Hamilton story. I can't help it, guys. There's a Hamilton story in which a Pennsylvania senator, William Maclay, wants a document from Hamilton in the Treasury Department for something that's being debated in the Senate. And he goes in person to the Treasury Department for this document. And he describes this in his diary. And he says, first he's made to sit down in like an outside room, and he waits for what feels like a very long time. Then he's allowed into an inside room where he sits for what feels like a very long time. Then Hamilton comes over and says, you know, what are you looking for? And he says, well, he wants this document. Hamilton says, well, that's in Mr. So-and-so's desk. We'll have to check with Mr. So-and-so. And he goes away. And then he comes back and he says, Mr. So-and-so is apparently out of town and has the key. So I can't give you the document, which to me is like an early documented case of red tape happening, being played out. And Maclay goes berserk in his diary. He's like, I can't believe that this happened, that, you know, but Hamilton's withholding a document from this congressman, doesn't want him to have it. I don't know if Mr. So-and-so was out of town and had the key or not, but it's clear that Hamilton was not eager to deliver that. So the question of how much power the executive branch had, always contentious, always, I saw somewhere monarchist goes whizzing by in Zoom chat. The idea of how close this president would come to something monarchical was a contentious issue. And people were very nervous about executive power, and executive privilege was bound up in that debate. Oh, I see someone saying,
they're discussing the mug right now.
They're discussing the mug. Okay. I was gonna say,
or mugs plural, I guess.
Mug plural, yeah.
Carolee did ask this question, and so we always try to talk a little bit about today, and maybe you have some thoughts on this. She asks, when Joanne talked about writing her book, she talked about asking questions, but being open to the evidence that pops up to change course. Today we have people for whom the evidence doesn't matter at all.
Right.
So is more evidence the answer for them, or is the fact they feel disenfranchised, evidence doesn't matter, etc., the answer for them to try to figure out how to make it truly feel like they are part of the conversation?
Wait, repeat that for me. I kind of missed the.
Sure. So the question is this idea of being open to evidence and allowing evidence to help change our thinking. And she's noticing that there are people today for whom evidence doesn't matter. So is the answer more evidence, or is it a different way of approaching, or is the answer a different way to approach the problem to help them feel more part of the conversation before you can give them more evidence? I know it's kind of it's a complicated question, but I think at the heart of it, what we're trying to really understand is this idea of how does the act of, let me phrase it this way, how does the disposition that historians have, which is to examine evidence and allow that to help shape a narrative, how does that translate into everyday life today?
Right.
How do we get more people to behave that way?
Right. And so the part of that question is part of the answer, which is, I don't think more evidence is at this point is going to be helpful. I think it will be perceived by those who don't want it to be true as still not true. I do think, and I know that this is happening out there in the world, I do think that we need at an early age, and given the time we're in as far as technology is concerned, to teach students how to ask questions about evidence and evaluate evidence, how not to take something just because it's online as true. You know, so that's in a sense an easy answer, but I think it's a really important one that maybe not everyone has fully grappled with yet, is the degree to which the question of evaluating evidence it's not going to go away. It's just going to become complicated in different ways with new technologies. And this is one of many ways in which a history degree has added value in addition to the knowledge it gives you about history and about the present, and that is the concrete skill of figuring out evidence. I teach my students that all the time. If they quote, well, actually, before they write research papers for me, I will tell them they cannot just go online and quote something online. Why? Who was, you know, and I'll ask them, who put that there? Do you know anything about them? Is that Joe in his garage, or is that actually an accredited, responsible organization or person? So that's part of the answer. As far as a bigger answer, I at this point have an answer to that. I think that's precisely where we're at, is everyone, including historians and, you know, Matt and I and everybody else, have to really evaluate evidence to a degree that we're not used to. So, you know, on Twitter, I usually, if I'm being alert, look things up online, try to figure out if they're true. Even when something seems like it should be true, I can't assume that it is. So I think, you know, we've talked before about core problems. I think last week or the week before, we talked about the absence of a we, about Americans not thinking about other Americans, the absence of a collective we. That's a core problem. And I think the inability to agree on facts and evidence, which is a remarkable sentence to utter, but I think that's a key problem of the moment that we're in now. And I think bound up with that is new technologies, not so new technologies that are being used in different ways and having a different impact. Another part of what we're struggling with now. So someone asked earlier, I saw also whiz by, when people teach about this era, will there be a day or a week or a month? You could, I joke all the time on Twitter that, you know, I'm writing my dissertation on January 30th, 2019, whatever. There will be, it feels as though you could write an entire dissertation on a day. But all of the things that I just stated are going to be things that people will be writing about because they are key defining components of the moment that we're in, without clear answers that we are grappling with. And it's our process of grappling that historians will want to look at and understand how we're working our way through this, all of these things in the moment that we're in.
So Francesca sort of read our minds. We had talked about this during our meeting a couple weeks ago, and I'm kind of curious. It's worth raising a question since this is anything goes. Why does the president have a pardon power?
Oh,
can you talk? And you may not be able to, because again, we're springing this on you, and yeah, it's not like you had time to go back and look. Why does the president have pardon power? Like, what is this pardoning power? Where does it come from? Is it like from governors of the colonies, or governors?
I actually don't have the quick answer to that, which is a really good question, which I will return with next week. That's what I tell my students when I don't know an answer. I will write it down when we're done and return with detailed information on it. But I don't absolutely have the answer for that as far as concrete facts, dates, explanations. There's something I don't know. Oh, Francesca. Yeah.
She got you.
Yep.
All right, we have done all of the questions in the Q&A. It's 10:56. Got a couple minutes to wrap up. Any other thoughts? Anything else you want to talk about today that is on your mind that we have not covered yet? That was a question for Joanne, not for, although it could be for the whole audience as well. What would the founders and families find most surprising about our perceptions of them?
Well, there's
a what if question for you.
That's a big what if question. And there are a lot of possible answers, but one of them is something I think about all the time. And that is the degree to which we know everything they've written.
Right.
I think to myself, if I ever met Hamilton, and if he were willing to discuss politics with me because I'm a woman, he would be stunned by the fact that I could say, well, you know what you wrote in May of 1792. I mean, imagine how weird that would be. And he, you know, who of us remembers anything we've said or written to that degree? So for one thing, although they thought about posterity, some of them understood that they were founders of a sort. Their study of ancient founders, you know, gave them the sense that founding a nation is a big thing, and they understood all of that. Even so, the degree to which they have been studied, analyzed, and probably in their eyes misunderstood and misinterpreted, but also the depth to which people are willing to go, the things that people have studied. There's a wonderful anecdote about this. It maybe is a good way for us to move towards an end. And it comes from a diary that has nothing to do with Hamilton. So William Plumer of New Hampshire, he's in Congress under Jefferson. He's a Federalist, but he's kind of a mellow Federalist who, and so Jefferson likes to chat with him because he's kind of always trying to get Plumer over to the sunny side of the tracks. And Plumer decides he's going to write the first history of the new government, right? He's very history minded. He goes into rooms in the building where Congress meets to save documents that are being trampled because no one's taking care of documents. So he's a person historians love, but he goes to talk to Jefferson and he says to Jefferson, I want to write the first history of the new government. And I want to talk with all of the people who are involved in it. You know, I'm going to want to interview you. He mentions a number of other people. And Plumer writes in his diary that there was the weirdest response from Jefferson. He said Jefferson, as Plumer was explaining what he wanted to do, Jefferson's face went from being interested to being nervous, to being kind of surprised, to being kind of displeased. Like there were like 5 emotions that flashed over his face. So Plumer goes to, I think, John Quincy Adams and says, what was that? Like, I just said I want to write a history, and he had the weirdest response. And Adams says, you just watched him evaluate his own political career. You just watched him think about what was going to be said about him, and he wasn't really comfortable with everything that would be said. That's really striking. And that's a pseudo answer to what we're talking about here, is that they would be discomfited in a lot of ways. And that was, you know, as close as we can come to physical evidence of that.
I think that's a fantastic spot to stop today. We are just about out of time. We will, of course, transition to the after party here in a moment, and I'm going to turn it over to Joanne just a second to wrap up for the day. But before I do, Rabbi Beth reminded us that tonight is the first night of Hanukkah, and we want to wish all of our friends of the Jewish faith a blessed and happy Hanukkah, and hope everybody stays safe and well. And we'll see you next week. So, Joanne?
I will join you in wishing everyone happy Hanukkah. I think one of my brothers is going to Zoom light a menorah for my parents, which I appreciate. And actually, hopefully I can find a way in on the Zoom Hanukkah moment. But as always, I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank you all for being the Yay History Matters, National Council for History Education community that we are. The fact that we are community, we see that every week, but particularly in weeks like this week when we're just open to questions, and that we can have that kind of good-spirited, wide-ranging, free kind of conversation in a good spirit and in a spirit of inquiry, that we can pat ourselves on the back. I want to thank you again for proving that we can do this, for proving that this is possible, for sustaining us for all of this time. And hopefully Matt and I will see a lot of you next week when I will figure something out that we will talk about, and we will meet together to talk about it. So for those of you who have not been here before, we now are going to switch to, and Newbie says hello. It was like one little peep. We're going to switch to the, okay, now it's not one peep. Now he's going berserk. Newbie, we're just going into the after party. For those of you who have not been here before, we are now segueing into the after party when we stop recording and we have a less formal, as formal as this is, conversation open to whatever we want to talk about. So stick around if you want to be part of the after party. And if not, see you next week.
And